Invite on stage our keynote speaker, Dr. Swarnim Wagle, for his address.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here. I think this is the third iteration of the Infrastructure Summit, and I'm privileged to have addressed all of them. And it's good to see this series going from strength to strength and, picking up new and relevant topics. And I'm sure, this will really help the government and the nation at large in pursuing this, the infrastructure-led development strategy that the government has adopted in its 15th plan and other important documents. I'll try to make an academic case for connectivity. I'll highlight the status of the various modes of regional connectivity and as it stands in Nepal vis-a-vis our region. I'll suggest a particular stance regarding China and India, and I'll conclude with a few organizing principles for infrastructure-driven connectivity. Let me start with three facts, three issues that really highlights the importance of this topic to a country like Nepal. Now, there are about 40 landlocked countries in the world with a population of more than 250,000 people. So of these 40 countries, fairly populous, only 6 are rich. And they're, the usual suspects: Switzerland, Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Luxembourg, and Hungary. And the defining characteristic of all these rich 6 landlocked countries are they're in the heart of Europe. They're in the heart of the largest common market in the world. So the issues of distance and this penalty that you bear for being further away from world markets doesn't apply to them. And in addition to that, they all have access to rivers that are navigable. So bear this first fact in mind. The second is, 10% of the world's population lives in landlocked countries, only 10%. But 80% of them are poor by global standards. So landlocked countries host 10% of the world population, but 80% of those people are poor. The third fact is you send a standardized container, 20-feet container, from the port of Baltimore in the United States to Kolkata. Today it costs around $1,000 to $1,200. But you send the same container from Kolkata to Kathmandu, it costs around $2,000. Right? All the way from Baltimore to Kolkata, $1,000, $1,200. From Kolkata to Kathmandu is close to $2,000. There's even a more extreme example when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa. You send the same standardized 20-feet container from Madrid to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, it costs only $700. From Dar es Salaam to Kigali in Rwanda, it costs about $4,000. Right? So this, these three examples, I don't need to, narrate long essays on this topic. If you just mull over these three facts, it tells you that if you are a lagging, landlocked country with, without abundant oil or minerals, you need to be connected. If you want to instill any hope of a healthy or respectable catch-up. And this we've known since 1775. The year when the modern Nepal started its journey as a nation state. Prithvinarayan Shah died in 1775, and I've repeated this at many occasions. The first modern, rigorous classic on development economics was written by Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and he talks about this, right? He talks about how water carries is cheaper than land carriage, industries grow first in coastal areas, and he explains why. The channels are very related to economics, of course. It's through the avenues of market access and technological diffusion. And his own entire thesis is wealth creation is a result of productivity gains through specialization. So this is the one-line mantra. If you want to grow rich, wealth creation is a result of productivity gains through specialization. Specialization needs division of labor, but the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So this is where, productivity, wealth creation, division of labor, specialization, and the size of the market can all be pulled together. So what will transport infrastructure do vis-a-vis the agenda of development? Well, it reduces trade costs. It leads to convergence in prices. There is lower price volatility, and resources are reallocated in such a way that they tend towards reflecting comparative advantage. Right? The second thing that transport infrastructure, well-built, resilient transport infrastructure does is it integrates markets. By integrating markets, it enlarges the size of markets that then allows firms to exhibit increasing returns to scale. Right? This is an issue about efficiency. So you can do more with less, basically. And the third thing is factor mobility aids efficiency, and this spurs growth, cuts costs, and fosters externalities. Now, I don't want to go into the details, but some of the striking examples where the importance of regional connectivity can be illustrated is through some of the flagship engineering projects that have been undertaken globally. My favorite example is the Suez Canal, built in 1869. It cut distance, it cut danger, and it cut costs. So the whole journey from London to Bombay was shortened by 41%. The distance from London to Shanghai was shortened by 31%. And the Panama Canal, the other canal built in 1914, it cut distance and costs by 60% if you had to go from New York to San Francisco. Right? So these are historical, sort of proven examples where connectivity cuts costs, spurs economic growth, and fosters externalities. In modern day, in the 21st century paradigm of trade and production, almost 80% of our global production is now led and steered in some way by global value chains. And goods needs to cross borders multiple times. So, that accentuates the importance of swift and cheap crossing of intermediate goods across borders, extremely important if you want to be competitive. So connectivity, it's not just being closer to centers of commerce and to your neighbors, but now it's become an economic imperative. If you merely want to stay afloat, not just being competitive and sort of leading the charge, but just to stay afloat, this has become a very important agenda. On the economic growth, I think capital formation at low levels of economic development, capital formation is extremely important. And the easiest way to pump in money is into areas of physical infrastructure, transport, energy, telecom, and that can easily propel you from a low income status to a lower middle income status. Then the game changes. You need to really invest on research, innovation, skills of your people, and other more sophisticated infrastructure. But the easiest way to make that leapfrog at very low levels of development is through capital formation. This is what we've learned from the East Asian example. The other important point to note here is, the world's economic center of gravity is moving east. Danny Qua at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy has this very interesting paper where he shows in 1980 the center of economic gravity globally was in the middle of the Atlantic, basically reflecting the two world motors, the two more economic engines, Western Europe and the United States. That is shifting with the rise of China towards the east. In 2008, that hypothetical economic center of gravity was around Helsinki. 2050, it will lie just along the Himalayas, reflecting that China, India, and Southeast Asia will emerge as the dominant economic centers. Now, for a landlocked country, there's a stylized evidence that if neighbors, there's something called neighborhood effect. If neighbors grow by 1% economically, on average, generally across income categories, neighboring countries, because of the spillover impacts, they tend to grow by around 0.4% additionally, right? But for landlocked countries, your dependence on neighbors is so pronounced that that correlation is almost 1% to 0.7%, right? So if you are a coastal economy, you serve the world. If you are a landlocked economy, you tend to serve your neighbors. That's destiny. So the point is, the neighbors' transit infrastructure, if it improves from 25th to the 75th percentile, half of the traditional handicap associated with landlockedness can be lifted. So this also, academically, you can make a case that transit infrastructure, it's cutting costs, but also spurring economic growth. And there are other externalities that I'm not going to go into in detail, but reducing spatial imbalance, fostering economic unity through mobility, and the investments that we can foster in human capital, education, health, better schools, cutting distance, access to better doctors, things like this. These are all social externalities associated with connectivity. But there's also something about in a democracy. We live in a vibrant democracy. So there's a merit to be attached to freer movement of people and goods, carrying with them new aspirations, new ideas, information about new technologies. I think some of these intangibles also get reflected in the progress of nations. Now, on the status, all the panelists I see will speak on their respective areas in detail. But let me just touch on the 6 pieces of modes of connectivity that I think we should be focusing on, or have been focusing on, but maybe reorient some of our priorities, right? The most important mode of connectivity for us is land connectivity as a landlocked country. It already accounts for 90% of all passengers and freight movement in Nepal. But we still have the lowest road density in South Asia, with 39 kilometers of road per 100 square kilometers. And the disparity within Nepal, province 3 versus province 6, for example, is much more pronounced. Last 25 years, we've made great progress in enlarging the network of access, road access. We have, I think, 40,000 kilometers of decent road. The rest are what we've been calling dozere vikas, hard to maintain and led by, even if you discount that has done some good, but it has also brought a lot of environmental damage. But the emphasis here has been on access, right? And we need to make that leap now from access to efficiency. So how many kilometers of expressways do we have in Nepal now? 0. But that's the kind of investment that we should be making. There's one that's underway. Hopefully it will come into operation soon. So on land connectivity, it's high quality expressways and roads connecting Nepal with itself, connecting Nepal with its northern neighbor and also its southern neighbor, and eventually branching out all the way to Southeast Asia. Air, I think I'm quite passionate about air connectivity. For a landlocked country where a lot of the prosperity rests on producing weightless products or products with high value to weight ratios, air cargo, air transit becomes much more important than for a coastal economy. Within 5 hours of flying distance from Kathmandu, you can access half the world in terms of GDP as well as head count. And that's an amazing opportunity for us to fly from Kathmandu and reach, serve markets from Tehran to Bali and from Beijing to Colombo. And as this center of economic gravity moves east, this will become a much more potent source of economic development for Nepal. The dominant models of production and trade that we saw in the world in the 19th and the 20th centuries was shipping-dependent trade that penalized landlocked countries. That, I think, will be a lesser force for change going forward, and this we need to harness. The Minister for Civil Aviation is here. I think this is a vastly underexploited area. I was looking at some numbers. We've entered into air service agreement with 39 countries, but only 13 are in operation. We've negotiated yearly traffic rights for 8 million airline seats, but only 3 million are being used, 9% by Nepali carriers and 27% by foreign carriers. So things that have been negotiated, rights that exist to be usurped, we've not been able to exploit. Hopefully, with improvements in the only international airport that we have, a couple that are coming up, and upgradation of at least a few of the 34 domestic airports that we have, I think will be a big plus. On the railways, I don't need to go in detail, but I think at least getting started rather than engaging in these tall talks about fast trainways coming from China and linking Delhi and all that. Let's get started with piecemeal segments in Province 2, through Province 3, reaching up to Province 5. I think economically, so by serving centers of economic agglomeration, it will make a lot of sense for the movement of people and cargo. Land acquisition will be a big challenge there, but this is an area where we're in a position to show some early results, and hopefully over the next few years we'll see some movement in this area, going beyond talk and rhetoric. On waterways, there's some exciting movement on exploring navigability in rivers like Koshi and Narayani. Prime Minister's visit to India, I think there was some memorandum of understanding to explore this in detail. Now India, but a lot of our progress on both rail and water is dependent on what our neighbors do. And here we need almost a game theoretic kind of strategizing where we position ourselves very carefully vis-a-vis what others are doing. So there's this Rashtriya Jalmarga Ain 2016 in India, which talks about developing 111 waterways. And their waterway number 1 is the one that is very relevant to us. So by reducing costs, saving on transit expenditures, the speed of transportation. There are environmental costs associated with regular dredging, for example. Our existing treaties need to be amended to reflect these new possibilities. But let's start the homework. And let's not forget that something similar has been tried before. In the early 1970s, Jogendra Jha and Vasundhara Shah actually started Nepal's first shipping corporation, Royal Shipping Corporation, named after one of the many wives of Prithvinarayan Shah, Narendra Rajya Lakshmi. But that company went bust. Right? So let's learn from the past and let's do things differently, because the policy landscape and the whole infrastructure stuff has evolved. But anything that we can do to reduce distance and to enhance productivity, we should be pursuing. On energy trade, I think the Secretary of Energy is here, so he'll be able to talk much more in detail on this. Our installed capacity is about 1,000 megawatts. But there's a huge potential for trading energy, right? And the underlying logic for trade in economics is your endowments have to be different, so that trade allows gains from specialization based on different technology mixes and the minimization of cost of generation. India faces a seasonal daily load variation. Their peak demand in November starts at 7 o'clock, lasts for just 1 hour. In May, in the middle of the summer, it starts at 8 o'clock but lasts until midnight. Our imbalance is slightly different. We've focused much more on the non-storage kind of electricity generation, the run of the river. So, how do we manage these imbalances? Different peak demands, different seasonal variations you need to trade. Right now, we've been importing around 500 megawatts of energy from India, which is transmitted on a radial mode. There's a lack of synchronization between our grids. So connectivity, energy connectivity needs to take this into account. We need possibly to move into back-to-back HVDC lines. And also, the quicker we strengthen our east-west transmission, just like we used to say that the Mahendra Lokmarga, east-west, would be a great backbone to serve the northern hinterlands of the Gangetic Plains. The same is expected to apply with our east-west transmission line. But the technical details, with the MCC being involved and all that, I think we'll be able to hear from our panelists. The sixth mode is, of course, digital. And this is where I think, again, for a landlocked country, harnessing these potentials is particularly poignant. I've been reciting this number because I find it very striking. After Baudal, 1991, the 8th plan said the entire country of Nepal has 71,560 phones. Now, each one of us carries a very smartphone. The 30 million phones that we carry, The cellular subscriptions rate exceeds the population, the head count. So there's massive, this has been a classic example where Nepal, by being backward, has been able to take advantage of that backwardness and then leap to the frontier of technology. But we've not harnessed it for e-governance and e-commerce to the extent we should be. And this is where I think a lot of focus should be in the months ahead. There are wide gaps in coverage, quality, and cost. And this is where I think internet is 4 times more expensive than in India. There's absolutely no reason for this kind of a market behavior and anti-competitive practices to be sustained, especially for a landlocked country where we need to negate those traditional handicaps by being very liberal in terms of policy. In 2012, there was a famous paper from the World Bank, a working paper. The problem with landlocked countries is, yes, distance and costs, and these are more than average, but it's the mindset that is more of a problem. So it's not landlocked that's an issue, but it's being policy locked as an issue. And they gave an example of how, in terms of regulatory regimes, landlocked countries across Asia and sub-Saharan Africa tend to restrict the very services, such as telecom, such as airlines, such as logistics, which would have given them the wherewithal to negate the traditional barriers to landlockedness. So policy locked versus landlocked, I think that's an important discussion. Now, on some words on China and India. So we're very excited about the ambitions of China and how we can extract positive spillover effects from there. China has historically been a very benign alternative to our other neighbors and the Western countries. But with its growing clout, I think a lot of its practices and values are coming under great scrutiny. Everyone has been talking about BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Officially, it has 5 components, but for me, I find it convenient to group into three segments. The first is related to physical connectivity and policy coordination regarding large-scale infrastructure. Not much of an issue there. The second cluster is on trade, investment, and financial integration, which subsumes topics like monetary policy coordination and financial cooperation. There are some issues there. We need to be careful on how these are packaged and presented and negotiated. Issues of non-reciprocity between an LDC and a non-LDC, for example, will loom large when it comes to actually working on the numbers in these economic partnership agreements. And the third component is cultural exchange, people-to-people bonds. We all love traveling and flying, so not much of an issue there. But how these different strategies regarding soft power, the exercise of soft power is taken forward, at least needs to be monitored. So issues of costs, financing, and project implementation modality, if we are smart in negotiating these on our terms, I think we're in good shape there. President Vidya Bhandari and President Xi witnessed the signing of a total of 7 bilateral agreements, I think last year. So the opening up with the protocol to the agreement on transit transport, Nepal's theoretical possibility to use 4 Chinese seaports and 3 land ports in Lanchao, Lhasa, and Segatse, I think, again, will need to make commercial sense, and it's the private sector that needs to latch on to these opportunities and develop them. I don't want to go into the details on the BRI. On India, I think a big challenge for us in Nepal has been to seek sovereign reciprocity in a structurally asymmetric relationship. So that's the fundamental, that's how we should characterize our relationship with India. And within this constraint, sovereign reciprocity, but in a structurally asymmetric relationship, what does that mean? What kind of projects do we pursue? How do we pursue them? How do we fund and sustain them? How do we share the benefits? These are all issues that will loom large. And often find this concept of 3Ds, not just looking at distance on a map that is relevant. You need to factor in density and divisions in terms of currency, in terms of language, culture, and other aspects. So when it comes to exploring avenues of cross-border collaboration, it's distance, division, and density that we need to take into account. Let me refrain from going from details, and let me end with a few concluding thoughts. I think if you distill all this what I've said so far, it boils down to five priorities, policy priorities. The first is about thinning our borders. Thinning our borders. So there's a concept called thin versus thick borders. Thick borders are the ones that you see along the southern borders of Nepal and India right now. Go to Jogbani, go to Roxol, sometimes you feel like weeping at the state of infrastructure there. We need to thin the borders if we want to participate in the new emerging sort of global economy, where, as I said, multiple movement of goods and people across seamless borders will be a necessary condition to even stay afloat in today's marketplace. Second is on investments and financial cooperation. So here, how do we adopt the old tried and tested model of flying geese, as countries like China, as Japan did in the 1930s and the 40s, as it sheds low-end, low-productive sectors, how do we latch onto them? We've kind of missed the boat. I give this example of the entire Chinese leather industry, for example, moving to Ethiopia, whereas we could have attracted just 10 or 15% of that segment here in Nepal, because what Ethiopia was offering was preferential market access to the European market and the United States through AGOA. Nepal has that access to the European Union. With the United States, it's not AGOA, but something slightly different, which was introduced in the aftermath of the earthquake for certain products, 60, 70 products. I think we've missed many of these opportunities. We've been so bogged down in our internal disputes and political conflicts. So sharing production, relocating industries to lagging regions and lagging countries, that's where our economic diplomacy should be focusing on. And how do we make use of the concessional financial windows, not just through the traditional sources like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, but also these new sources, the Exim banks of the large emerging countries, new institutions like the AIIB, to really make use of that window while we're still an LDC or a low-income country. Because as our per capita income rises, these traditional sources of concessional financing will begin to be very stringent. Already, World Bank and ADB have been saying, your macro fundamentals are sound, you've been repaying your debt to GDP is less than 30%. You should be taking on borrowing on more onerous terms, right? This kind of concessional financing is really for countries poorer than you. So we don't want to be in that trap early on, before we've made this leap, before we've made, covered part of the infrastructure deficit. The third is on digitalization, to lower the cost of participation in the world economy. This is an area where we should be, again, pursuing really radical steps. All I see is very piecemeal, ad hoc, incremental steps. That's not going to be sufficient. The fourth is on the exercise of soft power, mutual exercise of soft power, people-to-people links associated with tourism and academic exchange. And finally, let's not forget the environmental aspect to all this. Fittingly, the topic here is resilient infrastructure. So this speaks to the importance of clean energy and the way we manage our regional commons. BRI will have touched 60% of the world's population. How that infrastructure to serve such a massive population catchment will be built. Will it be resilient? Will it be green? Will it be sustainable? That's a big question. If it's done right, all the geopolitical and environmental stability issues will have been taken care of, and BRI will become an example. More crucially, Nepal is a custodian of the beautiful, the massive Himalayan ecosystem. We support 10 river systems and 2 billion people's livelihoods. There is something called the elevation-dependent warming. So the global pledge, according to the Paris Climate Accords, is that we try to limit the average global increase in temperature to well within 2 degrees centigrade, relative to what the world temperature stood at the onset of the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. That will be a massive challenge. If we can become more ambitious and limit it to 1.5 degrees centigrade, I think a lot of the calamitous projections that have been made, the catastrophic impact of climate change can possibly be tamed. Nobody knows. There's a big uncertainty element. But the point I'm trying to make here is, even if the global temperatures were capped at 1.5 degrees, because of the altitude that we inhabit, the Himalayas will be 0.3 degrees Celsius plus. And if you go to the western side of the Himalayas, to the Karakorums, it will be even 0.7 degrees centigrades, right? So this challenge and projections from ICIMOD that if this challenge is not addressed properly, half the glaciers would be gone. And what will that mean for our water? What will that mean for our irrigation and agriculture productivity? What will that mean for other human needs? I think this will be an issue. So as we go forward, the importance of clean energy and the way we club that with the management of our regional commons will be extremely important. So with these 5 sort of organizing thoughts and other remarks, let me conclude my statement. And I look forward to hearing more details from our expert panelists here. Thank you very much.